My beloved sons and daughters in Christ, what you are about to hear challenges the way most people understand their everyday reality. It is not something many expect to think about when they enter a church, sit through a service, and then return to normal life. Yet, according to years of firsthand experience in exorcism ministry, there is a deeper layer to existence that most people completely overlook. They assume life is only what they can see and measure. But behind that assumption, there is a constant spiritual conflict that continues whether people acknowledge it or not. Many individuals walk into places of worship with no awareness that they are stepping into a space where unseen forces are believed within Christian tradition to be actively at work. They come in, they leave, and they assume nothing beyond the physical has happened. But from the perspective of those who have worked closely in deliverance ministry for many years, that assumption reflects a much larger problem: a widespread lack of awareness about what is believed to be a spiritual battlefield surrounding human life at all times. In over a decade and a half of work in exorcism ministry, there are accounts and experiences that have deeply shaped how this reality is understood. These experiences are not described as distant theories, but as direct encounters with cases involving severe spiritual distress. Some of these cases involve families who appeared completely ordinary on the surface, yet reportedly experienced repeated cycles of destruction and conflict that could not easily be explained by natural causes alone. In other situations, individuals believed that practices they considered harmless, such as certain forms of physical exercise or cultural wellness, trends had unexpected spiritual consequences that affected their peace of mind and emotional stability. There are also accounts of individuals in religious life, including clergy, who were said to face intense internal struggles and disturbances when their spiritual discipline weakened or became inconsistent. From this perspective, the underlying message is not that everyday actions are automatically dangerous, but that intention alone is not always considered sufficient to prevent spiritual consequences within this theological framework. A central idea emphasized in this teaching is that opposition does not always require dramatic events or obvious confrontation. Instead, it is suggested that neglect, indifference, or lack of awareness may be enough to create vulnerability. In other words, the belief is not that people must actively engage with wrongdoing to be affected, but that simply ignoring spiritual realities could itself create exposure. This is presented as one of the most overlooked aspects of modern religious life, where many individuals assume that basic participation in rituals or identification with a faith tradition automatically ensures protection. However, within the framework being described, that assumption is challenged. The concern raised is that many people consider themselves spiritually secure while not actively maintaining what is seen as a disciplined or conscious spiritual life. There is also a strong assertion that the timing and reception of such messages is not random. The idea is presented that individuals encountering this message may be doing so at moments of personal uncertainty, internal conflict, or repeated patterns of difficulty that they cannot fully explain. These experiences are interpreted as possible signs that something deeper may be occurring beneath the surface of ordinary life. Within this perspective, the message itself is framed as something that reaches people at moments when they are already searching for answers, even if they are not fully aware of it yet. This creates the foundation for a much larger warning about awareness, perception, and spiritual vulnerability. From here, the discussion moves into a more structured theological explanation rooted in traditional Christian teaching. A key reference point is the passage from Ephesians 6:12, which describes struggle not as something purely physical, but as something that extends into a spiritual dimension involving forces of influence and opposition. This passage is interpreted as evidence that life is not neutral, but rather part of an ongoing conflict in which individuals are always, knowingly or unknowingly, engaged. The argument presented is that there is no truly inactive state in this framework. People are either becoming stronger in their spiritual condition or becoming more vulnerable over time, even if they are not consciously aware of it. Building on this, the explanation introduces the concept of a structured and organized opposition within the spiritual realm. It is claimed that, according to traditional theological interpretations and accounts from exorcism cases, these forces are not chaotic but hierarchical. They are described as operating with levels of authority, coordination, and purpose, in a way that resembles structured command systems. The idea is tied to the belief that fallen angels retain aspects of their original order, and that this structure continues even after their fall. From this perspective, opposition is not random but strategic, with different levels of influence and intent working in coordination. This introduces a stark contrast between what is described as organized spiritual opposition and what is often perceived as a passive or symbolic understanding of evil in modern culture. From this point, the explanation turns toward what is described as long-term and inherited patterns of spiritual influence, where the effects are not limited to a single individual, but are believed to extend across families and generations. In this framework, certain recurring struggles, such as cycles of addiction, anger, broken relationships, or persistent psychological and emotional distress, are interpreted not only as personal issues or environmental outcomes, but sometimes as patterns that continue with unusual consistency across a family line. The claim being made is that these patterns are not always random or purely behavioral. Instead, within the traditional exorcism perspective being presented, they are sometimes understood as the result of what are called familiar spirits or generational influences that observe, adapt, and exploit weaknesses that repeat within a family history. The idea is that once a pattern is identified, it can be reinforced over time, making it feel as though the same struggles are reappearing in different individuals of the same lineage, even when circumstances change. To illustrate this concept, a specific case is described involving a woman who reportedly experienced severe spiritual and emotional distress. Could not be easily explained through ordinary medical or psychological evaluation alone. Her symptoms were described as a combination of intense fear, recurring nightmares, physical discomfort without clear diagnosis, and a persistent inability to engage in prayer or spiritual practices. According to the account, her family history included involvement in Freemasonry several generations prior, and this historical detail was considered significant within the interpretation of her condition. During what is described as a formal deliverance process, it is claimed that a non-physical entity was compelled, under religious authority, to disclose its point of entry into the family line. The explanation given was that influence had entered through a generational act of dedication and had continued quietly over time, gradually intensifying its effect across successive generations until it reached her. Whether understood literally or theologically, the purpose of this account is to emphasize the belief that past spiritual actions may be considered to have long-term consequences within certain religious frameworks, especially when they involve formal rejection or redirection of faith. From here, the focus shifts to what are described as the most common and underestimated entry points for spiritual influence in modern life. Unlike dramatic or clearly identifiable occult practices, these are presented as activities that many people consider normal, harmless, or even beneficial. The argument being made is that danger in this context does not always appear in obvious forms. Instead, it is often embedded in cultural habits, wellness trends, entertainment, and curiosity-driven practices that do not initially seem connected to spirituality at all. This is where the warning becomes more direct, that ordinary participation in certain activities can, within this belief system, create what is described as an opening or door that allows spiritual influence to take hold. A central example given is yoga, which is framed not simply as physical exercise, but as a practice with spiritual origins and meanings that extend beyond its modern fitness interpretation. The claim presented is that the structure of the practice, including postures, breathing techniques, and associated philosophies, originates from religious systems in which those physical forms are tied to spiritual concepts. From this perspective, even when individuals engage in yoga purely for health reasons, without any intention of spiritual involvement, the argument being made is that intention does not fully determine outcome within this framework. Instead, it is suggested that participation itself is what matters because it connects the individual to a system that is viewed as spiritually active, regardless of personal belief. Similar concerns are extended to other practices such as energy healing systems, including Reiki, which are described as forms of channeling or connection to non-material sources of influence. The explanation offered is that when healing is sought outside of traditional religious authority or divine source, it may involve interaction with unknown spiritual forces whose origin cannot be clearly verified. A case is referenced involving a practitioner who reportedly experienced temporary healing results in others, but also observed recurring or shifting problems afterward. Within the interpretation being presented, this is taken as evidence that the source of such influence may not be stable or aligned with what is considered spiritually safe within the Catholic framework. This section then broadens into a wider warning about practices such as consulting psychics, using divination tools, or engaging in what is described as curiosity-based spiritual experimentation. The central idea is that even when these activities are approached lightly or for entertainment, they are still considered forms of engagement with spiritual forces outside of accepted religious boundaries. The argument being made is that exposure itself, regardless of intent, is enough to create vulnerability. In this worldview, curiosity is not neutral. It is treated as a potential pathway that can lead individuals into deeper levels of influence over time, even if the initial interaction seems insignificant or harmless. The discussion also extends into the influence of media, particularly horror films, occult-themed entertainment, and digital content that repeatedly exposes individuals to imagery associated with fear, darkness, or supernatural themes. The concern raised is not simply about emotional impact, but about the shaping of imagination and perception over time. Within this framework, what a person repeatedly consumes visually and mentally is believed to influence their internal state, gradually normalizing concepts and symbols that are considered spiritually harmful. This is described as a slow process rather than an immediate one, where repeated exposure reduces sensitivity and increases openness to ideas or influences that would otherwise have been rejected earlier in life. The underlying message of this entire section is that vulnerability is often not the result of a single major decision, but rather a collection of small, seemingly insignificant choices that accumulate over time. Within this belief system, awareness becomes the critical dividing line. Those who recognize these openings are seen as able to avoid them, while those who remain unaware are considered more likely to experience influence without realizing the cause. This sets up the next part of the teaching, which moves toward defining the different forms of spiritual affliction and how they are believed to manifest in human life. From this point, the teaching moves from identifying perceived entry points into a more structured explanation of how spiritual affliction is classified and experienced. The aim is to make a distinction between different levels of influence, because within this framework, not all spiritual suffering is understood in the same way, and not all cases are considered equal in intensity or effect. What follows is a breakdown of how these states are described in traditional exorcism terminology, where the focus is placed on how deeply a person's mind, body, environment, or will is believed to be affected. The first category described is possession, which is presented as the most extreme and least common form of spiritual affliction. In this state, it is explained that the influence is no longer external, but has reached a level where the body itself is controlled by a non-physical force. However, a key point emphasized in this teaching is that even in this condition, the person's inner will and intellect are not considered completely destroyed. Instead, they are described as being overshadowed or overridden in terms of physical expression, meaning the person may still internally resist while externally appearing controlled. This is why, in reported cases, individuals may speak in unfamiliar languages, display unusual physical strength, or reveal knowledge they were not previously aware of. Within this theological interpretation, such manifestations are not random, but are considered signs of a deeper conflict occurring at the level of body and spirit. The second category is oppression, which is described as far more common than possession. In this condition, the influence does not take control of the body, but instead affects a person externally through circumstances and experiences. This can include persistent physical ailments without clear medical explanation, repeated accidents or misfortunes that appear unusually patterned, financial instability that seems to escalate without obvious cause, or ongoing relational breakdowns that resist resolution. The key idea here is that the suffering is experienced as external pressure rather than internal takeover. From this perspective, oppression is often viewed as a gradual process that can intensify over time if the underlying cause is not addressed within the spiritual framework being described. Next is obsession, which shifts the focus from external events to internal mental experience. In this state, the primary effect is on thought patterns. Individuals are described as experiencing intrusive, persistent, and often distressing thoughts that feel foreign to their own mind. These may include impulses toward despair, fear, self-harm, or rejection of faith. The important distinction made here is that the person is still fully aware and functioning, but their internal mental environment is believed to be under sustained attack. The result is a sense of mental exhaustion and confusion, where the person struggles to distinguish between their own thoughts and those that feel imposed or repetitive in nature. Within this interpretation, obsession is seen as particularly dangerous because it targets perception and emotional stability rather than physical control. The fourth category is infestation, which extends the concept beyond individuals and into physical spaces. In this case, the focus is not on a person's body or mind, but on environments such as homes or buildings. Reported signs of this condition include unexplained temperature changes, sudden disturbances in objects, unusual sounds, or a general sense of heaviness or unease within a space. Animals may behave unpredictably, and individuals may report feeling uncomfortable or anxious in specific areas without clear reason. Within this belief system, Such phenomena are interpreted not as random environmental anomalies, but as indicators that a location itself may be subject to spiritual disturbance. Following this classification, the explanation shifts to what is described as the actual process of exorcism, with a strong emphasis on correcting public misunderstanding. It is stated that popular media has significantly distorted the reality of this practice, often portraying it as dramatic, chaotic, or theatrical. In contrast, the real process is described as structured, disciplined, and centered on prayer and authority rather than spectacle. The exorcist is not portrayed as someone performing a performance, but as someone invoking specific prayers and religious authority through established rites, particularly those found in traditional liturgical sources. Within this process, the use of sacramentals such as holy water, prayers of the saints, and scripture readings is highlighted as central. These elements are described as having spiritual significance within the tradition, not because of physical properties, but because of their association with divine authority. The act of commanding a spiritual force to depart is framed not as a personal power of the individual priest, but as an invocation of a higher authority believed to operate through the church. This distinction is emphasized repeatedly, reinforcing the idea that the effectiveness of the ritual is not dependent on the human participant alone. The account then describes the reactions reportedly observed during such rites. These include intense physical and vocal responses, emotional distress, and sudden changes in behavior. However, it is also noted that alongside these dramatic reactions, there are moments of release and calm once the process is complete. Within this interpretation, those moments are understood as the resolution of spiritual conflict, where the individual returns to a state of peace after what is described as liberation from external influence. The emphasis is placed not only on the struggle itself, but on the contrast between distress and relief that follows. This section ultimately reinforces the broader argument of the narrative that spiritual reality, as understood within this tradition, is active, structured, and capable of producing both suffering and relief, depending on one's condition and actions. It prepares the foundation for the final portion of the teaching, which moves from diagnosis and description toward what is presented as a practical response and method of protection. From this point onward, the message shifts from describing the nature of spiritual affliction to what are presented as reported insights gained during exorcism cases, along with the theological conclusions drawn from them. Within this framework, it is claimed that during formal deliverance prayers, certain entities have allegedly communicated specific statements under religious authority. These statements are not presented as independent revelations, but as part of a broader tradition in which such interactions are interpreted through the lens of Christian doctrine. One of the most frequently emphasized claims in this section is that these forces are said to react strongly to symbols and practices connected to core elements of Catholic faith. A central point repeatedly highlighted is the reported reaction to the figure of the Virgin Mary. Within this narrative, it is stated that during exorcism prayers, demonic forces are described as expressing intense resistance or fear in relation to her role in Christian theology. This is interpreted not as a matter of personal devotion, but as a doctrinal claim about spiritual authority within the Christian worldview. In the same way, the Eucharist is also described as a focal point of confrontation, with emphasis placed on its significance as understood in Catholic teaching. The argument being made is that these elements are not symbolic alone, but are believed within this tradition to carry real spiritual authority that is recognized even within the context of exorcism accounts. From here, the focus shifts toward what is described as the most effective form of protection against spiritual influence. Rather than relying on extraordinary interventions, the message stresses ordinary religious life as the primary safeguard. This includes participation in sacraments, regular confession, and consistent prayer. Within this structure, the state of grace is presented as a key concept. It is explained as a condition in which a person is considered spiritually aligned with God, therefore not exposed in the same way to external influence. The claim being made is that maintaining this state is not symbolic but foundational to spiritual protection in this worldview. Alongside this, devotional practices such as prayer to the Virgin Mary are emphasized as part of a broader protective discipline. The Rosary, in particular, is described as a structured form of prayer with historical roots in Catholic tradition, associated with sustained reflection on key events in the life of Christ. Within this teaching, it is framed as more than repetition, but as a form of spiritual discipline that reinforces focus, intention, and consistency. The claim is that such practices are not optional enhancements, but are considered essential tools within this spiritual framework. Fasting is also introduced as a significant element, described as a practice that strengthens discipline by limiting physical indulgence. Within this interpretation, fasting is not only a physical act, but also a way of reinforcing spiritual awareness and control over personal impulses. It is presented as part of a long-standing tradition within Christianity, practiced historically by both clergy and lay believers, and seen as a means of aligning physical behavior with spiritual intention. The discussion then moves towards sacramentals, objects and rituals such as holy water, blessed salt, scapulars, and medals. These are described as external signs associated with spiritual protection, not because of inherent power in the objects themselves, but because of their connection to religious blessing and tradition. In this framework, their use is considered a way of reinforcing spiritual boundaries within daily life. The emphasis is placed on consistent use rather than occasional or symbolic participation. Attention is also given to the structure of liturgical worship, particularly traditional forms of the Mass. Within this perspective, the liturgy is described as more than a communal gathering, but as a structured form of worship that carries theological and spiritual significance. The argument being made is that reverence, structure, and continuity within liturgy are seen as reinforcing spiritual stability. Changes in form or practice over time are interpreted within this narrative as having broader implications for spiritual life, particularly in how individuals engage with their faith. At this stage, the message transitions toward a broader assessment of modern spiritual vulnerability. It is suggested that many people become exposed not through dramatic choices, but through gradual disconnection from these traditional practices. The idea presented is that neglecting prayer, sacraments, and discipline creates a slow weakening of spiritual structure. Within this interpretation, vulnerability is not immediate but cumulative, developing over time as practices are abandoned or reduced. This leads into a structured outline of perceived strategies attributed to spiritual opposition. These include isolation from religious practice, discouragement through emotional or psychological distress, deception through distorted beliefs, gradual desensitization to moral and spiritual concerns, and disruption of family and communal bonds. Each of these is presented not as isolated events, but as interconnected methods that work over time to weaken spiritual resilience. The underlying message is that influence is often incremental rather than sudden, making it difficult to recognize until patterns have already formed. In this final section, the entire message shifts from explanation into action, laying out what is presented as a practical response to everything described so far. The tone becomes more directive, focusing on what a person is expected to do once they understand the framework of spiritual struggle that has been outlined. The central idea is no longer analysis, but responsibility. Within this perspective, awareness without action is treated as a serious risk because it leaves a person exposed while giving them knowledge they are not applying. The first step in this response is described as a complete removal of anything considered a spiritual opening in a person's life. This is framed as a process of honest self-examination, where every habit, practice, object, or form of media is evaluated, not only for its surface purpose, but for its deeper spiritual implication. Activities and objects associated with practices like occultism, divination, or alternative spiritual systems are presented as things that must be fully abandoned rather than modified or partially reduced. The emphasis here is on total separation rather than gradual change, based on the belief that partial removal is not sufficient to close what are described as spiritual doors. Within this framework, elimination is considered necessary for restoration of spiritual safety. The next step is confession, which is presented as a critical turning point in addressing spiritual vulnerability. In this context, confession is not treated as a general expression of regret, but as a structured and specific act in which an individual openly acknowledges involvement in actions considered spiritually harmful. The importance of detail is emphasized, as clarity is believed to allow for proper guidance and resolution within the religious structure. Confession is described as the process through which spiritual consequences of past actions are formally addressed, allowing for what is understood as reconciliation and release from their effects. Following this, attention is given to the concept of blessing one's environment, particularly the home. The home is described as a central space of influence in a person's life, and therefore one that requires intentional spiritual protection. Ritual blessings, prayer, and the use of sacramentals such as holy water are presented as ways of establishing boundaries within that space. The idea is that daily environments should not be spiritually neutral, but actively aligned with religious practice, reinforcing a sense of protection and order within the household. Daily prayer is then introduced as a non-negotiable discipline. Rather than being occasional or situational, it is described as a consistent practice that builds spiritual stability over time. Structured prayers such as the Rosary and specific devotional prayers are presented as tools for maintaining focus and continuity in spiritual life. The emphasis is on repetition, not as empty ritual, but as a form of disciplined engagement that reinforces awareness and resilience. Within this framework, prayer is described as something that must become part of daily rhythm rather than an optional activity. Regular participation in Mass is also highlighted as a central practice. It is described as both a communal act of worship and a source of spiritual reinforcement. Within this teaching, the Eucharist is considered a key element of protection and spiritual strength, and frequent participation is presented as a way of maintaining alignment with that belief system. The idea being communicated is that consistent engagement with sacramental life is not only devotional but protective in nature. Fasting is then reintroduced as a complementary discipline. It is framed as a practice that strengthens internal control and reinforces commitment through voluntary limitation. By reducing physical indulgence, it is presented as a way of sharpening spiritual awareness and discipline. Within this structure, fasting is not occasional but intended to be integrated into a regular pattern of practice, reinforcing other spiritual habits. Another key step is personal consecration and devotion, particularly within Marian spirituality. This is described as a form of complete dedication, where an individual intentionally places themselves under spiritual guidance and protection through structured prayer and commitment. Within this framework, it is seen as an act of alignment with a protective spiritual order, reinforcing the broader system of belief being described throughout the message. Living in what is called a state of grace is also emphasized as an ongoing condition rather than a one-time event. It is described as a continuous effort to avoid actions considered spiritually damaging, combined with regular self-reflection and reconciliation. This condition is presented as the foundation for all other practices, because without it, other actions are considered less effective within this belief system. It is framed as the core of spiritual stability. Protection of the family is then addressed, expanding responsibility beyond the individual. The family unit is described as a shared spiritual environment that must be actively guided, taught, and protected. This includes shared prayer, moral guidance, and careful attention to influences such as media and external environment. Children are specifically emphasized as requiring heightened protection due to their perceived vulnerability within this framework. Finally, the message concludes by returning to the theme of reassurance within belief. Despite the intense descriptions of spiritual conflict, the final emphasis is placed on the idea that ultimate authority and victory belong to Christ within this worldview. The opposing force is described as limited in scope and subject to divine boundaries. The final instruction is not fear, but action grounded in faith, suggesting that once these practices are embraced, the individual is not powerless, but fully equipped within their spiritual tradition to live in protection and stability.